Hello everyone, welcome to Coffee Cup Enlightenment. Today I'm going to be sort of answering, I've got three sort of prepared questions that I'm going to ask the question and then give the answer. Some of the questions, they're pretty common and are generally experienced by most people. But I guess what the first question is, it's just a general question on why do we identify with the mind? Why does this happen? And sort of in the previous video, it was sort of described how some thoughts pass through our field of awareness, and other thoughts have a tendency to become identified with. Why does this happen? And it's the reason why is because there's that pie of consciousness that hasn't been self-realized yet. So the answer to why we become identified with is because this eye of awareness is not recognized as your identity yet. It's what the eye of awareness sees in the world, which is thoughts, and they become identified and turned into your identity. And the reversal of this process comes by seeing a thought as just a thought, and then that consciousness opens up and becomes realized, and then that same thought now can't be identified with anymore. So why do we identify with the mind? It's because this hasn't been realized. If this was there's no such thing as I feel as total realization to some extent. I feel like the attribute of who you are is infinite and eternal, and infinite being is only the mind. Through the mind realm, there comes concepts of beginning and end and birth and death, whereas this essence of who you are has nothing to do with any of that. It was never born, it never dies, and it doesn't have a beginning and an end, and it's infinite and it's vast. And so technically speaking, there is no point of arrival. It's just a continual awakening, and this, the process of having a mind that's invisible, and the fact that our consciousness is invisible inside of us, the two get mixed up, and through witnessing the mind, we can then see that I am this, I am the witness to the mind. I am not the mind, I am the witness to it. And then this becomes realized as the witness. So that's who you are. If you ask the question, who am I? I am the, I am that sees, not that what I can see. That's the answer of who am I. And that that sees, it can be felt, known, and realized, and it's not necessarily something that's subject to believing and a thought, because then it just becomes, if you say this is who I am, a thought, that's not who you are. You are this. So that's why everything ultimately, which is identified with who you think you are, which are ultimately thoughts, they need to be seen as just thoughts for this to be realized. Otherwise, you continue to create nudges. Every thought, what you think you are, is it's a limitation, because this is infinite and vast, whereas a thought is subject to conditions, whereas this is unconditional. And so that's the the process of why we identify. Another one is, this is something that some people, not everyone, experiences. It's people say to me, and I've sort of used to experience this as well. It's just a typical stage in our identification processes that some, or maybe perhaps most people, need to go through and bring awareness to it, and break the identification. And that is the feeling of backwards, feeling I'm going backwards in life. So say for example, using these plates, this is how you naturally came to this point at 20 years old. So you got all these thoughts that you identified with, and life's become quite heavy, and your vision is obscured from you can't see reality, because all these levels layers of thoughts of mind have become identified with and are blocking your vision of reality. And then maybe you go through a stage, whether it be naturally, where most of these identifications disappear because somehow it just happens naturally, this identification. And then, or maybe you just go through, as described in these videos, where you practice self-inquiry, where you look at one thought at a time, disidentify with it by seeing it's just a thought and it's neutral and it's innocent. Do the same with this one, and this one. And now life is experienced as quite freeing and quite light and enjoyable, and there's clarity in your vision. And then what happens, it appears they've come back. Why does it come back? And what this video is here to describe is whatever comes back, if it was truly disidentified with all these mind concepts, then they would represent an awareness realization within you that represents, say, there's I'm only giving examples here, but there's 5 concepts here that have been seen as just concepts, and the innocence of their nature have been recognized, and this has opened up 5 points of consciousness. Now it appears we're going backwards sometimes, because now we're back in this state again. But if I had different colored plates, it's actually the thoughts that have been removed then now become neutral. And then I'm going to bring this around, and now new thoughts come that haven't been brought into your field of awareness yet. And so they are different thoughts. The apparent reality of backwardsness, that we've gone backwards, is impossible. You cannot go backwards. Once realization occurs, it's only new thoughts, not necessarily new thoughts, but thoughts that that your consciousness is, they correspond with the consciousness that hasn't been awakened yet. So and that's why they're innocent thoughts. They're only here, if we do become identified with them, to bring about the realization of the consciousness that hasn't been awakened yet, that hasn't been self-realized yet. And if it appears to go backwards, it's because there's new thoughts that haven't come into your field of vision yet. And this is the process. Maybe one day scientists may actually map out the entirety of all concepts that is possible, and it probably we may be quite surprised to find that it's actually not much. It's probably only maybe consists into 2 categories, and then that 2 categories maybe branches out into maybe a few dozen other categories, and that's it. And once you bring realization and awareness to these different categories of, and pretty much all of them are judgment related, they're or label related upon reality. And once you sort of see the innocence of all thoughts, basically it's just mind, and there's no more confusion between here is mine and here is you. There's no more confusion between the two. That this, you know who you are as this and no longer this. Then thoughts no longer become identified with, and when they no longer become identified with, they no longer create corresponding emotions. And because you don't experience these emotions, what's left is to experience the effortlessness of the world. And that sort of ties in with the next sort of question, which is emotions versus states of being. All emotions come from identification with a thought, and which ultimately means identification with the mind. And as sort of mentioned before, the only reason you identify with that particular thought is because the consciousness hasn't realized itself amidst this particular type of thought. So that's where emotions come from. So ultimately, this might seem a little bit sort of pretty straightforward, but emotions never come from reality. It's impossible. But there needs to be, I guess there's not in our language, states of being doesn't have much kick to it and much, appeal to it. But that's the only sort of word I can come up with. The states of being is looking at reality, and what you're looking at is a direct union. It's a direct reflection of yourself, and it creates, states of being. And states of being do not have create opposites. They do not create nudges, and they don't create any disturbances. States of beings come, and then they go, but they're direct experience of reality when there's no more mind tainting your vision and obscuring your vision. Whereas emotions only come from identification with mind. And it's most emotions, they're harmful, even if you are identifying with particular thoughts. And you can even identify with particular thoughts to create excitement, the emotion of excitement, and nothing wrong with that, as long as it doesn't create too much nudging and all that. It's only the emotions, I guess, that create quite a nudge and a disturbance, and they're the ones that need to be looked at. There's lots of emotions that don't really create any disruptions in our lives, and but ultimately they're not necessary in their entirety if you look at it. But it's only the emotions we want to look at, such as say frustration. An example of frustration is here is the world which is neutral. You're looking up at the world and it's neutral, and now a judgment from the mind comes, and you identify with that judgment, and that then obscures the neutrality of the world from being experienced, and instead you're now identified with this judgment, and you're so identified with it that you cannot see it as just a judgment, and you cannot see its neutrality, and it then becomes your reality. And as it becomes your reality, the corresponding emotion of frustration is born. So frustration does not come from the world, it always comes from identification with a thought, and ultimately, which means identification with mind. And that's something to test out. Everything I've sort of talked about in these videos, they're best tested out on small things, such as, test out the frustration experience at the line at the post office, and just notice that there's always a judgment in the background, and see if you can notice that judgment that's appeared, that's creating the line should be shorter, the line should this, the post office should this, which is a judgment, and it's your identification with that should, which creates the emotion. Now, once you undo that, once you recognize this judgment and see that is the cause of the emotion, not the world, not the queue at the post office, then you can actually, while you're in a state of peace and clarity, you can go up to the post office and say, is it possible to hire another person or something? But this is where true effective action comes from. When you're in a state of clarity, there's a good example where, that you get cold soup at a restaurant, and when you're identified with the mind about the cold soup and it creates emotions, your response to the people at the restaurant would be I'll put this on top because that's what it's the identified state is what's wrong with you people? Don't you know how to cook soup? And then there's a personalness involved, and there's a reactivityness involved. But when there's no judgments of the mind that identified with, you just simply recognise, the soup's cold, and then you just say, excuse me, my soup's cold, are you able to heat it up? And they say, yeah, sure, no problem, thank you. And there's no dramas in that. So that's the difference in the way you respond to the world. One is done through you can technically call it self-created. It's an emotion that's self-created. But ultimately it's not necessarily self-created. It's necessary for it to happen. And this is where, what I'm trying to describe here is where the neutrality and the undoing of it occurs. The reason why it's necessary is because this pie of consciousness is not realised yet. If it was realised, this judgment wouldn't be identified with anymore. If it was realised, your consciousness, this judgment won't have any effect, it'll just pass. And if it was even more realised, this judgment would come and pass. It wouldn't have any effect. Throughout your day, there are many, many, many mind things that just pass like clouds. that aren't identified with and do not create any emotions. The only ones you need to address are the ones that are creating lots of emotions. And when you do address one at a time, for most people, they have lots and lots of states and they can't see it yet. They're convinced it's coming from the world, but they haven't seen yet all these judgments that are in their vision, and it's actually coming from identification with them. But once you address one at a time, it becomes lighter. Your life now becomes a little bit lighter, and your vision and the way you interact with life becomes much more neutral and effective. It doesn't come from this reactive mind identified state anymore. It doesn't come from the emotions and then the emotions being projected out onto others and your reality is distorted. But it is possible, sort of as described in other videos, if you're very lucky, if you're 1 in a million, all your identifications can disappear in an instant. There was a story I heard many, I don't know what it was, like 40, 50 years ago. There was a famous Indian enlightened master, and he wasn't much into what I'm talking about, had no idea what I'm talking about in these videos. He was just 18 years old. He was only a young guy, and he was like a typical 18-year-old, had certain level of identifications with his mind, and especially had identifications about who he thought he was as which was a conceptual self. And then one day a thought arose: what would it be like to die, or what would happen if I died? And in that thought, his consciousness could see that all the things that it had been identified with, and could see that would die, and then it realized itself as the eternal, and in that moment all the identifications disappeared, and a very high level of self-realization occurred at 18 years old. So much so that the story went that he actually walked off to the caves to die because he was just in so much bliss that nothing mattered anymore. And then because it was in India, they recognized this, and they actually have a word for it. It's called God intoxication, or something like that, God toxification or whatever. And the women recognized what was going on, and they followed him to the caves, and he lost his speech. He could no longer speak because he was just in such a dramatic transformation. Everything he thought he was just disappeared in an instant, and what was left was the enlightenedness that he already was. And everything was just so beautiful and amazing that there was, he went way too far into the other realm. And the women fed him and gave him water for 6 months, and then his speech returned, and then for many decades he became a famous talker about this subject of self-awareness and self-inquiry, and he did that for several decades. So yeah. So I hope that's brought a little bit more light and understanding to why we identify. What is backwardsness, and what are emotions versus states of being. Thank you very much.